Welcome to My Morning Cup, a podcast produced by Costa Media Advisors and brought to you by the generous support of the Tennessee Valley Authority. To learn more about TVA's impact on our community, follow TVA on Instagram at TVA and on Twitter X at TVA News. My Morning Cup, where we have interesting conversations with genuine people. I'm Mike Costa, your host. My guest this week is the president and CEO of the Chattanooga Area Chamber of Commerce. Charles Wood has been in his position now about a year, but he is deeply familiar with Chattanooga, having served the prior 12 years as the vice president of economic and talent development. Charles, welcome to My Morning Cup. Before we trace your career from Mississippi across numerous points in the Southeast to Chattanooga, let me ask, and I think I know what it is. What's in your morning cup?
It's always coffee and it's always local. I won't market my son's business, but it's always local coffee. If not, I'm in real trouble.
I'll market it for you. It's caffeinated, isn't it?
It is. And yeah, they do a great job.
Yeah. And we're here to talk about you, but wow, they came on the scene and have just exploded.
They've done a great job, and it's a good group. My son's built a great team and has some folks around him that I think he's really kind of lifted up, and they've lifted him up and gotten really engaged in the community. So they have a number of partners that are nonprofits. Right now they're supporting La Paz, as a matter of fact.
They do a different one every month?
They do. They shift. They have a couple that are long-term partners. And so Get Active is the big one, which is tied to Chattanooga Football Club.
That's great. And I will tell you this, Be Caffeinated is my wife's favorite coffee. And we are big on support local. So it's great to have success locally.
I saw a sign when I was in Charleston, and it was outside of a coffee shop, one of those, stand-up signs on the sidewalk, and it said, "Why would you come all the way to Charleston and drink Seattle coffee?" And I was just like, that's a great sign. I mean, like, that tells you should really embrace kind of your local groups that are out there and companies that are out there. So he's doing a good job, and I'm super proud of him.
That is such a great point. We were talking before we started recording about Tremont Tavern, and I'm always amazed at the number of people who go into Tremont Tavern and order a Miller Lite. You've got 9,000 beers.
You do. You got 9,000 beers and some great local breweries too. I mean, it's funny because when I first got here, there were only a couple, and we saw the brewery scene kind of continue to grow, and you've got folks like Odd Story and Hutton and Smith and Naked River that have come on the scene and done a great job.
Yeah. Well, you have not only done a great job at the chamber and been recognized that by being promoted to the president and CEO, but how you got there is a really interesting story. And we were talking about it a little bit before. You grew up in Mississippi, basically, high school, but kind of a circuitous route there. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, people always ask me where I'm from, which is a common question, right? That's a easy, like, how do you get to know someone? You ask them where you're from. And I'm like, well, if I have the time, I tell them it's really complicated, and I grew up in a rather unstable environment. And so, a lot of people have they have the nuclear family. I grew up in a more unstable environment. So I describe my mother as a serial monogamist. So she was married 5 times and had boyfriends in between. And so we moved around a good bit. And, but husband number 3 was Air Force. And so that's kind of how we ended up in Mississippi. We got stationed at Keesler Air Force Base after spending time in South Carolina and Illinois. And, it was a great fit for me. I love the Gulf Coast. It's a beautiful spot. And, certainly kind of continue to go back on vacations and things like that. But it led me to Southern Miss, where I met my wife, and, eventually ended up here in Chattanooga. And so Chattanooga's home at this point. I've lived here longer than anywhere else.
Yeah. You've been here more than a decade.
Yep.
But Biloxi's a great city.
It is. It's changed so much since when I was there. When I got there, the casinos didn't exist.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah. The Air Force Base was the big employer, and you had boat yards and shrimping industry was there and that kind of thing. But there wasn't that level of investment that you've seen come in from out of the state. And it's good and bad in my view. Like, there's some great things about it, but I'm not sure that it's not all positive.
Well, and that's an important note, and we'll get to that in talking about what you're doing now, because when you're trying to attract business, there's certain things you're giving up. And that's something that I think Chattanooga's done a good job of guarding.
Yeah.
Not giving up that uniqueness and our treasures, for lack of better description. I do want to go back to, the amount you moved around, because your experience growing up and my experience growing up was pretty different. When my dad passed away at 72, my parents were 5 months within their 50th anniversary. So I grew up in a pretty stable environment. Having to move around that much, I guess the best way to put it is, how did you cope? And what I mean by that is, my assumption is kids are going to do one of two things. They're going to introvert, read books, keep to themselves because that's who they know and trust. Or they're going to be really outgoing because, by golly, it's a new town. I got to go out and meet new friends.
Yeah. I mean, certainly I was more outgoing. And by the time high school kind of came around, I finished high school certainly as the class clown, as somebody who a lot of people knew. But I grew up as, I was pretty much a delinquent and a jerk. I was like, I'm going to cuss a little bit. I was kind of a jackass, and so by husband number 4, I'm like, how long do you think this is going to go, man? So I was not, definitely not the best stepson, when kind of at that point. And, fortunately, I had kind of a transition in high school, and this is almost every man's story, caused by a girl. So, and I thought she was totally cute. And I was like, well, are you going to be in this English class next year? And she's like, no, I'm going to be an AP. And I was like, I don't know what that is. So I was like, I went down and I was like, hey, I want to be in the AP English class, and they're like, no, you can't. Your grades are terrible. And so I was like, well, let me in and then I'll fail and you can move me. And so that transitioned, and I finished with, I think 15 hours of advanced placement credit in high school.
You talked your way into AP?
I did. Yes. And now nobody wants to do that because they don't want their grade point average to get hurt.
Right. They want to take the easier class, have the grade point.
That's right.
But kind of back to the point of how you dealt with all that moving around, you in a sense, you became a salesman.
A little bit, yes. Yeah. And then I've been a salesman most of my career.
Yeah. Did you grow up wanting to work in the chamber world?
No, no. I didn't know what economic development was. I didn't know what chambers were. I got my undergrad basically in international business with a Latin American emphasis. And my goal was to go out and work in U.S. embassies, right? I'd been around the military at that point a lot. Didn't want to be in the military. Like that was a little too kind of structured for me, but love the idea of kind of international travel. And so I got my undergrad in that. And one of my professors said, have you thought about getting into the master's program in economic development? And I was like, what's that?
Yeah.
And so I ended up in it. They paid my way, which was a huge deal because, I worked my way through college with student loans and jobs. And, but they offered me kind of a full ride and pay my way. And so my first job was Mobile Chamber. And then once I was in, and we worked on a project where we had a jeans factory. I can't remember if it was Levi's or something like that had shut down. And we recruited kind of a hardware technology company into that business. They hired everyone out of that plant that was going to get laid off. And I was like, this is how you have an impact, but I was definitely not on the Chamber of Commerce path at all.
So you kind of stumbled into that. But before that, you mentioned you wanted foreign service and that international economic development. Talk about your backpacking trip to New Mexico and Central America.
You don't do this at home, children. You would never do this now. But when I finished my undergrad, I got on a Greyhound bus in Biloxi, Mississippi, took it to Texas, to Brownsville, Texas, and walked across the country line into Mexico, and then backpacked through Mexico and Guatemala.
Were you alone?
I was.
Were you nuts?
Well, it wasn't what it is today.
But still.
And it's funny, the first, I was in Saltillo, and I remember I did not pay attention to what I should have been doing, and I should have negotiated my cab fare before I got in the cab.
Yeah.
And so afterwards, I had to pay him like 50 pesos or whatever, which isn't a lot of money, by the way, but at the time it was a lot of money for me.
And it was probably a lot of money for the cab driver.
Oh yeah,
he took advantage of it.
Yeah, that's right. He did really well. That's
economic development too.
That's right. And so I backpacked. I crisscrossed the country. I went from Brownsville over to Mazatlan on the West Coast. Almost didn't leave. Like Mazatlan was just incredible. I loved it, and I got in with a group of expats, and they were the Sunset Club. And every day they would go down and watch sunset over the Pacific Ocean, which I'd never seen at that point. Right? Never.
What a deal.
Yeah, and never gotten on a plane plane before. I mean, so this was a huge kind of experience for me. And I went back across to Tampico and down kind of along the Gulf Coast and crossed into Belize. And
was this after college?
This was after my undergrad, yeah. But before I went back to grad school, yeah. So it was quite the trip. I wouldn't recommend it today.
Yeah.
But I will say, even now, I think as I talk to friends of mine that travel pretty extensively in Mexico, once you get past a lot of the northern part of Mexico, it gets a lot. It's just a different environment.
Did you speak Spanish, or do you speak Spanish?
Un poquito. No es muy bien. But a little bit. And I spoke, by the time I got back, I spoke really well.
I bet you did.
And ironically, when I took a job in Texas, I thought I would really get to use my Spanish. And I got to College Station, which is a big university town. And come to find out, there were more people speaking Asian languages in College Station than there were Hispanic.
Yeah.
So, because it's a big university town. And so I never used it while I was there. And it's fallen off since then.
Yeah. How long were you gone?
So I think I was there a little over a month and a half. So it was a good trip.
But that's such an underrated thing, that taking some time off to travel. My youngest daughter travels quite a bit. She works in the outdoor industry, and just those experiences really change who you are.
Well, I grew up in a kind of a rough way, and I went down there thinking I was poor.
Mm-hmm.
And I came back realizing I was not poor.
I bet it was a stark difference. You look at what you have, and then you look at what your neighbor has. And
that's right. Yeah. Whole different level. So, learned a lot, definitely learned a lot and had an impact. And, but I, came back and went through grad school and, really have been in economic development, my whole career.
So you get out of Southern Miss with your master's and you head to Mobile. How long are you in Mobile?
Not long. The pay wasn't great. So
I was a shock.
Yeah. I was there for a little bit, and I love the Gulf Coast, but, I was already kind of looking for other opportunities. And so College Station, was a city government job, interestingly enough. So I was inside local government, as if kind of similar to working in, inside city of Chattanooga type environment. And was there for 7 years. So I learned kind of.
Oh, you were there a good long amount of time.
I was. And until Chattanooga, it had been the longest I lived anywhere there. So
in a town like College Station, how dominating is the university like Texas A&M? Does it dictate everything that goes on in that town?
I was afraid to stand when one place too long or they'd paint me maroon. I mean, it's, like, as a matter of fact, we had a developer come in town and they said, is there a requirement in the code that I have to have maroon accents on my building? And I was like, no, we don't put that in the code. People just do it. It's a phenomenal university. The engineering school is the largest on the planet. And so, it's just there's so many things that kind of happen around that, but it is all consuming in that community. Right. And I would imagine Tuscaloosa and Auburn and, places like that that is the driver.
I used to say that about Knoxville because I went to school in Knoxville. I think it's still true, but Knoxville's grown enough as a city to have a separate identity from the university to a degree.
Yeah.
The university still dictates quite a bit.
It does. And yeah, there's certainly a little bit of orange in town, but it's, you have Oak Ridge and TVA and some others. It's not quite to that scale that you'd find, I'd say, like in Athens, You
ever do the midnight yell?
I was at the Midnight Yell, and the first year I was there was the year the bonfire fell.
Oh, wow.
Which was, horrendous. And it was just this huge tragedy in College Station.
A number of people died, didn't they?
They did. And,
I don't remember the number.
I don't remember the number, but it was quite a few. And it was the first time I'd really kind of thought about, if you grow up on the Gulf Coast, you have hurricanes. And after the storm, the neighbors all come out and help. Right. And it's the first time I thought about that someplace else other than the Gulf Coast. And this outpouring from the community, the students that were there, I mean, it was incredible. And so there's a family and kind of a culture around that university that love my alma mater. That culture is just totally different.
Yeah.
It's just incredible.
I went to a Tennessee game down there, and it is a different place.
Yes.
I mean, it's a place you have to go experience at least once to really understand what you're talking about, of that cohesion.
Yep. But it was a great, my son was young and the schools were fantastic there. And so, it was a great place for him. But when I left, my boss at the time was like, why are you leaving? And I said, well, my visa ran out. You're not, like, if you're not connected to the university in that way, it is a challenge. And I would think it'd be the same way, if you're if you're not a Georgia alum and you're living in Athens, it's probably a similar dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. So you were there 7 years?
Was there 7 years, all in city government, and kind of worked my way up.
And what were you doing in city government?
So I started basically as an economic development analyst, worked a lot of economic development projects, and really finished running the economic development program for the city, and then engaged in community development and housing and some other things there. A lot of redevelopment work too.
Mm-hmm. That had to help you tremendously to, again, what you're doing now, understanding how all that works. But you left there and went to one of my favorite places, Pensacola.
Yeah, I went to Pensacola, and, again, Gulf Coast is, kind of rooted in my heart, and spent 5 years there. It was terrible timing. So left in the summer of 2006. Great recession, just hammered, the Gulf Coast in general, because there's so much reliance on the real estate market.
Well, you had Ivan come in 2006 also, didn't you?
Ivan was a little bit before. And you had Katrina in 2005 before. And so that
Ivan was 2004.
Yeah. But it was, it's a great town, and they've really come, as soon as I left, they just turned it around. They've come a long way. So that's done really well for them, but great city, some great people there. And the thing that's, both really interesting and really challenging though, is the military is such a huge component to the economy, and you don't have a lot of control over that. Right. So
you probably were able to compare that a bit to like Texas A&M. The Navy base similar to a college campus.
Yes, only there's more discipline.
You're right. There is more discipline at Texas A&M.
Yeah, I will say I grew to love the Navy. As a matter of fact, I at one point I told my son, if you're ever going to join the military, the Navy has the best duty stations. Like, as I realized the places we got stationed, Rantoul, Illinois was the place in Illinois I was at. They grew corn along the flight line. If you go in the Navy, you go to San Diego and Norfolk. And if you go internationally, you go to Italy and Japan. It's like, these are good,
Rantoul, Illinois.
Yeah, that's a very small town. It was, if you remember, what was the tour with John Mellencamp, the farm aid and all that? They came through there. Like, it was, a big farming community.
Oh, I bet it was. So were you recruited to Pensacola, or did you see an opportunity there?
There was a selection firm, headhunting firm that recruited me down there. And
that was for the chamber?
That was for the chamber. So I came in as senior VP of economic development at the Pensacola Chamber, and got to work on some incredible stuff. A lot of work with a big credit union down there, Navy Federal Credit Union, that they're on their way to, I think, 10,000 employees in Pensacola. It's a massive campus. And, really kind of shifted, I think, the view of white collar kind of professional finance positions in that market.
That was your first economic development job. You worked in city government, in economic development, but in a chamber world.
I was briefly in Mobile at the chamber there, but really I didn't spend as much time there. So Pensacola was really kind of a good experience from a chamber of commerce environment, and a lot of great leaders there. Our board had some phenomenal people there that were, I think, really passionate about building that community.
How tough is it, and I'm sure part of the experience here is true too, but how tough is it to recruit a company when tourism is such a driver?
Yeah. So I would say, different economies you have blessings and curses, right? And so the biggest challenge with recruiting kind of traditional economic development job creation, I think, not just in Pensacola, but across Florida, is the state doesn't have to be very hungry, right? Because the beaches are always beautiful and the sun's always going to shine. And so the tourists are going to come, and, Mickey's there every day of the year. And, so you have this economic driver for the state that doesn't create this dynamic where there's a hunger for economic growth. And if you think about, to me, I think and it's hard to replicate this, obviously, and you kind of don't want to, but if you think about the seeds of Chattanooga's success were in the fact that, we were in a really bad economic place. And so it created a motivation that, if you're in a university town, you probably don't ever have that motivation. One of my city council members in College Station said, you know what, if you don't win the project, it's fine. We got a new class of freshmen coming in next year and they're all going to Target, and so our sales tax is going to just, keep on, growing. And so having kind of that hunger, and kind of when you hit a point where you're just really in a challenged place, I think that's where communities can really make a huge kind of pivot and transition to something significant.
That's a point I never considered till you brought it up, particularly about Florida, that the state in general is looking and going, yeah, we're not really into incentives. Everyone's coming down to the beach and it's going to be okay. And the point you made about College Station, but where this town was in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And I think back to the Volkswagen project when that was announced, it was a statewide team effort. And when it was announced, you had Governor Bredesen and Senator Corker walking down those stairs at the Hunter Museum.
Yep, that's right. And it's Tennessee in general. We're an SET team, right? I mean, as far as the state goes in economic development, we're at the top of our game.
Yeah.
We've had, in the time I've been here, I mean, we had Senator Haggerty, as commissioner. We had Bobby Rolfe as commissioner. I mean, now we've got Stuart McWhorter. We've had these great leaders at the state level that have been appointed by governors that are focused on economic growth and economic opportunity. And every one of them didn't need a job. They weren't like, submitting their resume, to the state.
They weren't working for a paycheck.
No. And so, and they all brought this great business background. So I think that, is just a different perspective. And so, I think Chattanooga, with the leadership we've had locally, has leveraged that support from the state, and it's changed the story. I had a headhunter try and recruit me up to Detroit. As a matter of fact, after the recession, I was here. It was probably, 2014, 2015. And they said, well, don't you want to be part of America's great redevelopment story? And I said, yeah, I'm already here.
Yeah.
I literally told them that. I'm a part of it right now. And so I came in later in the chapters. I wasn't early in the book, but it's an incredible story.
Well, let's talk about that. You're in Pensacola for 5 years, and Chattanooga had success in the early 2000s and it's beginning to make some waves. Again, you're coming to Chattanooga, recruited, or you saw and said, you know what, that really interests me.
Yeah, I actually saw it. I had a friend of mine who worked at TVA that said, hey, have you seen this? And I threw my name in the hat. It was not a search. They didn't hire an outside firm to help with the search. And I honestly don't know why they hired me. I was, I'll tell you. And when I got here, it was kind of a strange experience. Like the hiring process was strange. Tom Ed Wilson was in place, and loved Tom Ed. The first phone interview I had, Tom Ed was, gave me the whole overview. And he said, do you have any questions? I said, I just have one. You're retiring. How's that going to work with the new guy? I didn't know who the new guy was at the time.
Yeah.
I thought, it'll be fine. Don't worry about it. And then they're like, come on up for an interview. And I came up for the interview and got through all the interview process, met with a lot of great people. And they said, do you have any questions? I said, I still have the same question. How's this going to work? And they hired Ron, who I know is a good friend of yours, but they hired Ron Harr, and Ron and I just hit it off. And so it's, for me, Chattanooga has been just this phenomenal fit. My wife and I have, fallen in love with the city. We recruited my son up here because, he didn't grow up here. And so that kind of sunk the anchor, right? I mean, that's a big commitment. I mean, I can't recruit him here and then, then bail. So we're all in and certainly love the city.
Did you know anything about Chattanooga, have a perception of Chattanooga before you came?
I didn't. So I actually, when I interviewed, I told them that the only time I'd spent in Tennessee was, I don't get to do it as much, but I love the outdoors. And so my wife and I would go up to Smoky Mountains and go camping. I mean, we'd go to Cades Cove and some of those areas. And so the only time I had spent in Tennessee was in a tent before coming to Chattanooga.
Which interestingly is what a lot of Gulf Coast people do. When they go on vacation, they go to the mountains.
Yep.
When we go on vacation, we just trade homes with them.
And I told somebody when I moved here that I just traded the beach for the mountains.
Yeah, that's a pretty good trade. I like that. And then I'm glad you recruited your son, because otherwise Be Caffeinated would be in Pensacola or College Station or somewhere like that.
That's right.
So you got here in 2012, Vice President of Economic Talent Development. Tom Ed retires. You're working for Ron Harr. What's that like?
Ron is probably the most fun boss I've ever had. I've had some great bosses, don't get me wrong. But as far as like working with someone who is a lot of fun, he was a lot of fun. And
he enjoys life. And that's what I like about him.
He does. He's truly a Renaissance man.
Yeah.
He can do, I swear he can do anything. And so, but really enjoyed it. A lot of things kind of going on. We had a big Volkswagen expansion while he was here. And so, we're, really kind of, I think, hit it off. And he really helped me embrace Chattanooga. I mean, I think he really shared with me the story because he'd been here for a long time and seen it happen. And so in part, as I got to get really comfortable with Chattanooga, a lot of that had to do with spending a good bit of time with him.
I first heard it from Ron. I know it's not originally his saying, but he's very famous for when people say, "Are you from Chattanooga?" Ron says, "No, but I got here as quick as I could."
And I now totally steal that line.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. As we all should. And it's true. Good guy. So, Volkswagen expansion story. We talk about some of the other things on the economic development side the first couple of years here that really kind of, because in my mind, part of it is not just you acclimating to a new town. It's to people acclimating to you because you're working in a very public position for not really just one boss. You're working for a lot of bosses. Anyone on that chamber board and very, very successful people who are used to running their own businesses, whose ideas are the best, are going to give you some ideas.
Yeah, that's true. You do get lots of ideas. And so, but what I'd say is it's the only city I've worked in, the only community I've worked in where I didn't really have to I haven't had to be a sales guy. I mean, I am, and I do that, but really it's a little different. It's more like a receptionist at a restaurant. So, I mean, I'm inviting people to the party, and the best projects we've worked on where we've had the most success, I think about, is I just invite the right people to the room. They sell the city.
Yeah.
And there's so many people in Chattanooga that are so passionate about this community that it's a matter of kind of curation, of kind of figuring out who's going to resonate the most with that specific company, right? And so, because each company is different, their corporate culture is different, their leadership's different. And if you can kind of get a feel for what's going to have that kind of strongest connection when somebody comes in a room, it's really powerful. And so that's how I've really spent most of my time in Chattanooga, is just really trying to figure out who from Chattanooga is going to help make the best case to a new company that's coming in.
Well, and what a better way for a company to understand a town than the people who have lived there and made it home, who are their biggest proponents.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And some of them aren't from here. That's the other thing, is some of them are companies and executives that have relocated here from somewhere else. But they've fallen in love with it. I mean, I'm getting to spend a little more time with Matt Patterson and Cam Duty over at Brickyard. Mm-hmm. I mean, both have kind of adopted Chattanooga. They came from Birmingham, and we had a project we recruited in about a year and a half ago that is iFixit. So they came out of California. They're gearing up in Onion Bottom. Redevelopment story, probably one of my favorite recruitment projects I've worked on. And they were part of that sales team, and so they did a great job, and they kind of worked with that company and kind of shared with them their story around what it's like to relocate to Chattanooga. So, it just kind of depends on the company and really kind of what their corporate values are and kind of how that works. But have definitely gotten to work on some great projects, both with new companies coming in, early stage companies and entrepreneurs, and then our existing business. Chattanooga is blessed with kind of this really diverse economic mix of industry. And so there's a Texas line, you dance with the ones who brung you. Mm-hmm. And so, you always got to do that. And we've got some phenomenal businesses that have been built here, created here, multi-generational, and have invested not just in their business here, but just invested in the community in a big way.
Yeah, I can understand that point of when you're recruiting a Volkswagen, the business that was started 100 years ago is here in Chattanooga is going, well, wait a second, we've done. So that's a hard balancing act.
It is. And I have an economic development friend of mine in Bradley County, Doug Berry, and his previous boss used to use this line of, well, if you tell me you're never going to have a layoff and you're never going to close, then I'll never have to bring in another company. And so, and that's where it's this really kind of delicate balance of, you as a community, their companies are just like people, right? I mean, they're born, they get married, right? They merge, they have babies, they spin stuff off, and, eventually a company can die. And so we have some that have been here a really long time, but we have others that, they kind of burst on the scene. They do really great, and then they're gone. And that can lead to a lot of really good things. I mean, think about Access America, right? I mean, changed, the entrepreneurial landscape, but there's no Access America in Chattanooga today. And so I think if you think about communities and their economies, you got to think about it a little bit like a garden, right? It's that curation and constantly kind of investing and seeding new things.
When you got here and spent a little time here, and you're comparing it to College Station, you're comparing it to Pensacola, what was the difference that you said, you know what, this is different? Because you've been here 12 years now.
Yeah. So again, I think the biggest difference I've seen is there's two things we have communities that come to Chattanooga all the time, right? And they want to know how we've done what we've done, how we've redeveloped things, how we've changed our manufacturing base, startup, whatever. There's a couple pieces to this. And I think the first and foremost is its leadership. If you go back over time in Chattanooga, you've had this phenomenal kind of local leadership in mayor's offices and elected leaders and in business community and philanthropic community that have poured themselves in to kind of rebuilding the community. And so that is hard to replicate. You can't just decide that you're going to go do that. And so I think leadership in Chattanooga has been so pronounced over the years, and the business community has really been kind of the driver. And that's not to say that the public sector isn't part of that, because, you just heard from Senator Corker, right? I mean, here's a business person, did really well, and then invested himself into the public sector and the public sphere. And, we're seeing that today with Mayor Wamp and Mayor Kelly. And so I think there's almost an expectation really that for folks that are going to be successful in the business community, at some point you're investing back into the community. That you may not want to run for office, but you got to do that. So that's, to me, that level of leadership is something that stands out against a lot of other communities. And then the second is, I think, this desire by people who are from here, but also who move here from somewhere else, to play a role in Chattanooga's story, to be a part of what Chattanooga becomes. And I think we are easier than in a lot of places. It's an easier place to get connected and plug in. And I tell people all the time, you're one email away from a meeting with who you want to meet with.
It's interesting you say that, because I've talked about that a lot on here. One of the things I've really enjoyed about being in Chattanooga, and I'm going into my 23rd year, I've been able to do things here I probably wouldn't have been able to do in Memphis or Atlanta or Nashville or somewhere else. And to your point, you're one email away from being able to meet with that person.
And not only are you able to be a part of those things, but you're able to see the impact.
Yeah.
And that's hard to do in just a really big market.
It's kind of like the water's warm, come on in.
That's right. That's right.
Because you do get to some places and people are very guarded. Well, no, we got this. Thank you, but we're good. And you play at best an ancillary role. But here you really get a chance to do some things that you can't do in other places.
Yep. No doubt about it. It's a unique environment. And I think that I don't know how you create that. And that's one of the things we share with companies that come in. And so I have gotten to work a lot with Sharita Allen when she was at the city in Chattanooga. And she has told me this story about, she was involved in, the visioning process and everything that happened in downtown. And she said, I was in the meeting where somebody said, or put on a whiteboard or whatever, that we should have a carousel.
Yeah.
And so there's a carousel sitting in Coolidge Park today, right? Because somebody was there and wrote it on a chalkboard or a whiteboard. And that's a minor moment in somebody's life, but think about how many people have taken their kids there.
When I moved here, my girls were 7 and 5. I can't tell you the amount of time we spent on that carousel. And for a shameless plug, a really interesting My Morning Cup podcast was with Jim Kennedy, because Jim was in almost all those rooms and moderating a lot of those charades.
Yeah, he was. You're right.
Yeah. So he's got a lot of those stories. You talk about local leaders, and traditionally the chamber, the president, CEO, was a former local business person. And that changed when Christy came in, Christy Gillenwater, with tons of chamber experience, and was here 5 years or so. What I found interesting as you were looking to move from vice president of economic and talent development, you're not a Chattanoogan, but people consider you one now because you've been here 12 years. So kind of the best of both worlds. We got a chamber professional, well, 3 worlds: chamber professional, economic development, and a Chattanoogan.
Yeah. And I will say, and I went through kind of an interview process for the position. I mean, I told the board, I'm an economic development guy, not a chamber guy. And so I've worked in chambers and I love the holistic aspect of a chamber of commerce compared to a standalone economic development recruitment entity. But my heart and soul is invested in, economic development and kind of the growth that can bring to a community. And I don't mean that just in terms of population growth, but if you think about the economic mobility and kind of opportunities that are created around that. And so my hope, over time, as I continue on at the chamber, is really to kind of steer the organization into economic development, and to really, I think, focus in on a few kind of big things that I think from a systematic standpoint help move the community forward and bring some people along who really haven't seen the same level of benefit in Chattanooga.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, and I'm going to get back to that, but I want to ask you, get it started in this way. I'm a big company. I'm the president, CEO. We're looking at relocating or building a second location. We call the Chattanooga Chamber. What happens?
So the first thing that happens is we try and get as much information as we can about who you are, what the business is, what the needs are, that kind of thing. So if you're, and I don't think this really matters what industry you're in, if you're in sales, you want to know as much as possible about your potential customer, right? And so there's certainly a level of kind of intake, if you will, as much as you can. And unfortunately, that's not usually how it works. Usually we get a call from someone who doesn't tell us what business they're in and only says, we're looking at a project. We want to put it in the Southeast. It's going to have X number of jobs and this much investment. And we're thinking about you as a community as a potential location. And we don't know who the company is.
So you're blind to a lot of facts.
You're blind to a lot of facts. Yeah.
It's like being in high school and someone saying, there's a girl that likes you, but I'm not going to tell you.
It's a little like that. Yeah, you're not wrong. And so, you go through this process of kind of courting, if you will, right? Yeah. So the more likely is they're asking you for lots of information that you're giving them, and you're hoping for an opportunity to learn more about who they are on the front end. And that's certainly from a recruitment standpoint, how a lot of that works. It is a process of making sure that you're ready to be able to provide that information and that you have the things that are going to be meaningful and make that company successful as they look for a new location. So I once heard Haley Barber say that economic development is really the process of preparation and getting ready. And if you think about all the work that, folks like Senator Corker and Claude Ramsey and others did at Enterprise South, that was really what that was, right? They were getting ready to win. And the way I try and explain that to people here is, how much time does a football team spend on the practice field versus in the stadium?
Yeah.
You spend a lot more time on the practice field, right? You got to get everything ready, everything lined up, everything perfect. And you have to execute over and over and over and over again. And then you get 60 minutes in the stadium. And if you're not ready, you lose. And there are competitors that are out there that are fierce. And that's something I think a lot of people in Chattanooga, but in a lot of places, don't fully understand the competitive nature of kind of what happens when companies start to figure out where they want to go. Mm-hmm. And so I think for us, as we think about what does the next 10 and 20 years look like, is how do we make sure we are being really competitive, both for new companies, but also for talent. We went from being a community where we lost our children, right? Our mm-hmm. kids grew up here, they went to school here, and then they left for college, and then they came back for Thanksgiving, and that's it. And so we've transitioned to a community now, frankly, where other people's children are coming to Chattanooga, right? We are their land of opportunity. And I think as we think about how we grow and what opportunities we want to create for our own children, that's really the question, is making sure that we are putting ourselves in a position to be successful in what is a very competitive landscape.
Who would you say is Chattanooga's biggest competitor? Is it one city or town?
Yeah, so we certainly compete against other communities for manufacturing projects almost always. Greenville, South Carolina, and Huntsville, Alabama. And if you look and see what's happening in both those communities, they're exploding.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the growth is not even comparable to Chattanooga. And so
Huntsville's now the largest city in Alabama.
That's right.
That's incredible.
Not Birmingham.
Yeah.
And how do you think Birmingham feels?
Yeah. Could you imagine? It's like your little brother beating you up.
That's right. And so it's, for us, those two certainly are competitive. And then for technology and office, the challenge there is it's heavy white collar and talent attraction. And so we compete against cities that are much bigger than us. We have folks that look here, look in Nashville, they look in Austin, they look in Knoxville. And so that's a different level of competition. And so when Nashville was growing, as an example, when they were winning a lot of big projects, they were actually incentivizing white collar jobs at $7,000 per job in cash.
Wow.
They did it over multiple years, but that's something that we haven't done, but that's certainly how Nashville was successful with projects like the Alliance Bernstein project that came in.
So if someone had 500 jobs and they're incentivizing it with $7,000 in cash, they're going to provide what, $3.5 million? I'm doing the quick math, something like that.
Yeah, that's right. So it's meaningful. And there are other pieces that come into that, right? And so when we kind of talk about how do you build systems that help us be really successful, it's what does UTC look like over the next 10, 20 years, right? What are their programs that are growing, and what are the companies that are out there need as they think about talent to grow? So there's systems inside, the community that we need to be really successful. And so I think Dr. Engel and others are working hard on that. You have a brilliant researcher in Mina Sartipi there who's doing some incredible stuff. And so, you need systems like that, like Chattanooga State, to be really successful. And we're blessed with some other partners. I mean, if you think about EPB and what they're doing, for us, there's opportunity to kind of invest in those systems. I think workforce development and talent development is going to be a big part of kind of what needs to happen in Chattanooga to be really successful. And
is that the biggest challenge moving forward, workforce development, education system?
There's a few, every community has challenges, right? And so
plus we're out of land.
Yeah, real estate is a problem. And one of the things I've tried to share with folks is it doesn't matter how good your workforce is. It doesn't matter how great your economy is. It doesn't matter how great your logistics are. If you don't have a place to put a company, you don't win. You just don't, that company doesn't come. But I'll go back to the who are our biggest competitors. I think one of our biggest competitors is ourselves. We've grown to a position where we're pretty proud of ourselves, candidly. And that's risky, right? And so I've tried to pay attention to coaches who are, say really smart things. And if you look at how Saban operates, right, he uses this line that success is rented.
Yeah.
And so the biggest risk, I think, for Chattanooga is just complacency, right? That we forget where we were and how challenged we were from an economic standpoint, and that we don't live up to the legacy that was, kind of presented to us by a lot of leaders that worked really hard to change the trajectory of the community. So I think as I think about kind of who we're competing against, in part, it's really about, how we're looking at ourselves and how we're making sure that every day we're trying to make things better.
I think that's a really good point. It was one Senator Corker brought up when we talked to him, because it's easy to get complacent. You use the sports analogy. You win in a bunch of games. Of course we're going to go out there and we're going to look good. And then before you know it, you're not doing the things you need to do, the blocking and the tackling.
That's right. Yeah. Less time on the practice field, feeling pretty good.
Yeah.
You go home and look at the trophies.
Yep.
And the reality is for Chattanooga, I think that we've got a lot of folks who have benefited from the economic growth, but we've got a lot of folks who haven't.
Yeah.
And so we have we have three guiding principles for our new strategic plan, but the two at the front, the first is economic mobility, right? It's around kind of the way I describe it is the rungs on the ladder need to be close together so that people can move up. And the second is economic inclusion, which means I don't care what your zip code is. I don't care if you have a high school diploma or a PhD. This economy should work for you. And so I think for us, as we think about, what economic development means as a community, that's got to be front and center. And we're blessed with a great redevelopment story. We need to continue it. I post a lot on LinkedIn, and one of the things I always say is, Chattanooga's story is a redevelopment story. And I think the Bend and what's happening on South Broad are two of the biggest redevelopment projects in our history as a city. And so, there's great opportunity for us, but there's a legacy we need to live up to.
Well, and I think it's important that inclusion is such a big focus of the Chamber's mission moving forward, because we've had a lot of success, but it has not been spread evenly.
Yeah.
And just to publicly recognize that is very important.
Yeah. My favorite project I've gotten to work on in the 12 years I've been here actually isn't a recruitment project or an expansion project at all. It's actually the Construction Career Center in East
Isn't that a
Chattanooga.
great place?
Oh my God. It's, the first time I walked in that building, it was a closed elementary school. I walked in it with Dr. Johnson and Leslie Gower and a couple others, folks you've interviewed. And I remember walking in, and they wouldn't let Dr. Johnson walk down one of the hallways. It was so bad. And now you go in there and you see the high school students that are in there. We had our first batch kind of finish in May, last year, and every one of them had work-based learning opportunity. Every one of them had an internship or a co-op. Several have gone on now into the construction industry with apprenticeships, and it's life-changing. And then for that neighborhood, for East Chattanooga, it breathed hope and life into that neighborhood.
Oh, it's a tremendous vision, and it really illustrates what's known as the Chattanooga way.
It does, yeah. And I'm not naive enough to think that the Chattanooga way was always perfect.
No.
But I do think that the best things that have happened in this community have been public-private partnerships that have really allowed community members and leaders to kind of partner together, really look to the future long-term. And it tends to be less about the people who are trying to put the deal together and more about the next generation.
Yeah. I want to get to a couple things before we run out of time. One of them is you race sailboats.
Well, sort of. I actually, I'm more like a deckhand, and and I listen to Frank Hughes grumble a lot about lack of wind or too much wind. So, but yeah, so no, I crew with a guy named Frank Hughes out at Privateer Yacht Club, and at some point I'll get my own boat, but I'm on the OPB program, so I'm on the Other People's Boat program, which is
How many people on a crew? Is it just you and Frank?
most of the time it's me and Frank. It should be 3.
Yeah.
And so that's the best case. We sail a 22-foot sailboat that's pretty fast. If you have 3, you get one of those big colorful sails up front, which is a spinnaker. And so that's the best case scenario. You only win if you have a spinnaker up.
How'd you get into that?
So, I had a weird, unstable environment, but I lived with my grandparents for about 5 years in elementary school when I was in New Jersey. And there's a lake in that neighborhood, very idyllic, a lot like kind of growing up in Signal Mountain. And so I learned to sail on Sunfish, which are kind of these tiny little boats with one sail, and started it. And then I completely fell off the wagon. Like there wasn't opportunity for me. Illinois doesn't have a lot of lakes, unless you're in Chicago. But I really started to get back into it actually after I got to Chattanooga. I'm embarrassed to say I didn't do it as much when I was in Pensacola. But it's a great time. You have to put your cell phone up.
Yeah.
You're totally disconnected for that time frame, or else Frank will kick me off the boat. And so, there's no motor, right? It's just the wind. And it is, for me, it is a great way to kind of disconnect. And it's funny because you don't really actually go very fast on a sailboat unless you watch the, America's Cup stuff when they elevate out of the water. But you don't go very fast, but it feels like you're going really fast. And so, for me, it's just a good way to kind of unplug. And
Chickamauga is a pretty good sailing lake. There's a lot of sailboats out there.
There are, now not as many as motorboats, right? For every one sailboat, there's probably 30 motorboats out on the lake. But Privateer has got this great history. I think it started back in the 40s. I'm not a great member. My job requires a little bit more time than some of the folks who are up there, but it's this kind of great little history. And they have a sail camp. They've got a nonprofit attached, and they have a sail camp there, and your kids can go out at, usually mostly younger elementary school age, and learn how to sail. And it's a great opportunity to get connected to that.
Well, if you want to get your spinnaker and you need a third crewman, I'd call up Ron Harr.
Yeah. Ron actually, he's been out there. He's raced out there before, and he's won, the Pig.
What's the Pig?
It's one of the regattas there. They do a barbecue around it. And I think it's one of his proudest victories, I think. So
I would imagine it is. Well, I do want to get to the last question, but before we do, I want to say thank you to the Tennessee Valley Authority for sponsoring My Morning Cup. Follow TVA on social media to learn more about its multifaceted mission of service, and visit TVA.com/do-good-here to explore exciting TVA career opportunities. So, Charles, here it is. Last question. What would you tell your 25-year-old self is important for a happy life?
I did not, I didn't have the best start. I was a bit of a delinquent in high school. And after I got into professional career, I didn't really share a lot of my background. And I think growing up, what I didn't realize was some of those things that happened to you, right? I mean, and again, a lot of people had a lot tougher time than I did, but those things that happened to you are what
would make you.
That's right. They're what make you. And so I think if I could have, I would have told my 25-year-old self, like, this is why you are where you are. And it sets you up to have an impact, kind of going forward on other people. Right. And so I think that, because I was not very focused on other people. And somebody asked me, why didn't you go in the military? I'm like, I was kind of a selfish jerk.
Yeah.
I think so for me, it's really kind of realizing, then that I should have realized earlier.
Yeah, but that's one of the great advantages to getting old is because when you're going through those things, we are all going to go, why is this happening to me? I don't understand. And as you get older, you look back on those things and you look at those lessons and the things that they taught you, and they really do make you who you are. If you didn't experience those things.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Charles, I'm really glad you're in Chattanooga. You decided to stay. There's great opportunities here. I've enjoyed getting to know you, and I really appreciate you coming in and talking to us.
Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to My Morning Cup, a podcast by Constant Media Advisors. If you liked this episode, please share it with a friend. I release a new episode each week, so be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts.